Okay, great. So we'll make a start now by setting our motivation. So thinking of this Mahayana motivation for studying the Lamrim. We need to understand these teachings so we can attain liberation to liberate all sentient beings. And with that kind of motivation in mind, we'll start by visualizing the merit fields and space in front. So whether it's just Shakyamuni Buddha on his own, or surrounded by the Mahasiddhas, or the Pandits of Nalanda, or the entire refuge field of your lineage if you can manage that. Just whatever you prefer. And then think surrounding yourself for all sentient beings in the aspect of humans. And thinking like your father, this life to your right, your mother to your left. Those who are close to you, behind you, and your enemies in front of you. And with this sort of visualization, we think then we're leading them in the prayers. So we start off with praise to the Shakyamuni Buddha, Guru, Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, perfectly complete Buddha, perfect knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha, knower of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and humans, to you, Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Guru, Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly complete Buddha, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha, knower of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and humans, to you, Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Guru, Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfect and complete Buddha, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha, knower of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and humans, to you, Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then recite the mantra Shakyamuni 3 times. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Mahamunaye Soha Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Mahamuni Mahamunaye Soha Om Muni Muni Mahamuni Mahamunaye Soha. And then recite the praise of perfection of wisdom, thinking, you kind of recite, praising Prajnaparamita, the Bodhisattva, and the Prajnaparamita teachings. And you're kind of condensing the meaning of the Prajnaparamita Sutras into this praise to him. Ma sam jo me shara paraji, ma ke mi gam nam ke no ni, so rang mi hi shi cho yo wa, tu sum gya wa yom la cha se lo. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasamgati Bodhi Soha. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasamgati Bodhi Soha. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasamgati Bodhi Soha. And then recite the mandala offering and refuge. Om Sa Shi Ho Hi. 你的眼光里是多美呀，灵犀。你的眼光里桑给是路。 미세우와이 로쿠나 도시라 조바쇼 이랑구 vatnamandala kamniratayani. And then refuge. Sangye chodam soni chodam 章丘巴度达尼卡苏奇，达伊春年一片松那里，多拉pen雪三月如破说三月就让桑尼就让拉，章丘巴度达尼卡苏奇，达伊春年一片松那里。多拉pen雪三月如破说三月。就让上你就让老，章丘保度当你看书记，大一去年也被送到一，做了盘踞三月的保守。Okay, so that brings us to the start of today's teachings. And today, moving on to the sort of fifth topic of the foundation of all qualities. Yeah, so we'll move on to the fifth topic of the foundation of all the qualities, which is the suffering of samsara. And for this, we sort of look at the text here. And it says in this verse, seeking samsaric pleasures is the daughter of all suffering. They are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. Recognizing these shortcomings, please bless me to generate a strong wish for the bliss of liberation. So here in this verse, we're moving on from the small scope of the Lama rim to the sort of middling scope. So up until now, everything we've covered is applicable to all scopes, but the teachings for the person of the small scope, and this concerns happiness in this and future lives. So then when we enter the middling scope, you're looking into liberation for yourself, and then when we go for the great scope, it's the liberation of self and others. So then why do we need to contemplate the suffering of samsara? Well, if we want liberation, we need to see the faults of samsara. The motivation we've got to see the flaws of this sort of samsaric existence to have the wish to escape it. So, over his teachings here, there's a quote from Shariputra, and it comes from a sutra, but I can't remember which sutra it comes from. But in this is sort of a conversation between different figures, between the Buddha and various arhats and bodhisattvas and just different people. And this Shariputra uses clairvoyance to point out someone's kind of faults with samsara. So here he says, he eats his father's flesh and hits his mother. The enemy he killed sits on his knee. A wife gnaws her human husband's bones. Samsara can be such a farce. So it said that this is happening while they're looking at a family. So there is someone sat there and he's got sort of fish in a pond and he kills and eats a fish. And then he has a dog sort of sat on his, child sat on his knee. And he's saying, this child that sat on his knee was once his enemy in a past life, but you wouldn't know it now because it's his most loved child. The fish that he's eating is his father that he once cared for. It's saying he hits his mother, so it's saying who was his mother in his past life is now his enemy in this life. And it's basically pointing out that when we're reborn in cyclic existence, we just have no way of knowing what relationship people were to us in the past. So you can kind of see you wouldn't treat your family like, those that you love, you wouldn't want to harm. So if you love them in a past life, why do you want to harm them in this life? So as much as it also covers the suffering of samsara, this kind of links to bodhicitta. And you'll see when we reach the great scope, this comes up again. So then there's a quote from Jigme Lingpa in his Treasure of Precious Qualities. And he says, we who board the supreme ship of higher realms escape for now the dreaded monster's tongue, the evil destinies. But since we have not reached the dry land of our freedom, in a captain we should place our trust, the four truths of the noble ones. Then the second verse, We should understand the truth of suffering. In all the six realms of samsara, high or low, no place is there but is entrapped in misery, of pain, of change, of all-pervading suffering in the making. So what Jigme Lingpa is saying here is that every realm in samsaric existence has the nature of suffering, as the saying that every realm of samsaric existence has this nature of suffering, has the suffering, suffering of change, and the all-pervasive suffering of samsara. He's also saying that right now we're a human, now we might be reborn as the gods, and we escape the extreme suffering of the lower realms. But we haven't reached liberation, so we're still going to suffer. So if we kind of consider suffering, then there's the general and the specific kind of divisions of suffering. So if we start with the general sufferings, there are six general sufferings of samsara. So the first is the suffering of the indefinite nature of samsaric pleasures. So whatever happiness we have in this life will not last. The second is the suffering of dissatisfaction. Constantly wanting more and more pleasure, and if we don't get it, we're not satisfied and we suffer. The third is the suffering of leaving the body again and again, constantly going through the cycles of birth, age, and sickness and death. This relates to the suffering of the fourth, the suffering of joining, suffering again and again. And this refers to samsaric rebirth. So the third and fourth kind of linked. The suffering of meeting suffering and being born and suffering. And then every time we die, we suffer. You suffer during the death process. Fifth, the suffering of rising and falling. So the result of being born in a higher realm is eventually you'll be born in a lower realm. And meeting leads to parting ways, life ends in death, these kind of sufferings. And then the sixth general suffering is the suffering of loneliness. We're born alone, die alone. So these six sufferings are sort of general to all samsaric realms. There's no realm where you're free from these. And then move on to the specific sufferings in a second. So the specific sufferings, they're related to each realm. And we won't go into too much technical detail because it can be quite boring to go through each of especially the hell realms, going through all 20 of them in detail. They're fairly similar, you'll see. So if we start off and we start with the lowest and we'll work up. So starting off with the suffering of the hell realms. So the hell realms are divided into three. There's the hot, the cold, and the neighbouring hells. In the hot hells, there's the reviving hell. In this realm, you're constantly born and as an adult, and you go straight into combat, and they, kill each other, and you eventually get killed. And then when everyone's dead, all these a couple of survivors, a gong sounds, and you're reborn, and you do it again and again, and it's just non-stop. And then there's the black thread hell, the hell of mass destruction, the howling hell, the loud howling hell, the heating hell, the intense heating hell, and then the eighth is the hell without respite. So you can kind of see the hot hells all are fairly similar. There's a lot of heat and, physical suffering of being stabbed, whipped, and so on. So really going into detail on these eight isn't necessary to really get a feel of them. You can kind of do an overview and think in the hot hells, you're going to be suffering of different types of being burnt alive, boiling oil and these kind of things, different kinds of fighting. And then a kind of point that comes up, and I've discussed it with a few teachers, and I know people have discussed it with Geshe Wangchen, a great master of the past, sort of in the 70s and 80s. So he was saying, because these hells are mind generated, the kind of suffering we experience in the reviving hell is also mind generated. So in the past, the kind of warfare you'd see would just be with swords, spears, and so on. And Geshe kind of suggested that in the modern times, in these hells, there's people with guns and so on. It's kind of what you're mentally used to. So then we'll move on to the cold hells. So the cold hells are the blistering hell, the oozing blister hell, the shivering hell, the moaning hell, the lockjaw hell, the cracking like a blue water lily, the cracking like a red lotus, and the enormous cracking like a great crimson lotus. So you can imagine these are just different degrees of being cold, essentially. So the start off one, it's like strong winds blowing and cold chills, and you get blisters form on your skin. And then the second one, it's even stronger, and these blisters crack and burst, and they ooze pus, and that freezes and causes suffering. And then the sort of shivering, it's known that because everyone makes the sound of shivering. And the same with the moaning, everyone's moaning from the cold. And then the lockjaw hell's so cold you can't even shiver anymore. And then the three cracking hells are basically the body has got so cold it shatters. Like you see rocks get shattered by rain getting into them, and then it freezes and expands and breaks them apart. It's the same thing here. So the difference between the three is the number of parts you divide it into, basically. So the blue water lily you split into, I think it's 16 pieces. And then the cracking like a red lotus, you split into 32. And the enormous cracking like a great crimson lotus, it's splitting into 64 pieces. So it's basically just degrees of intensity. Um, those numbers could be wrong. You need to check the sort of Lama Tsongkhapa, sort of the think Babonka's liberation, the palm of your hand too. These really extensive land room. These really extensive land room teachings cover it best. And then the neighbouring hells, so these sit in between the two, basically. And there's four, and there's the pit of hot coals, the swamp of decomposing sick quicksand, the three hells of weapons, and an acid river. So basically, in the pit of hot coals, you're trying to get. In the neighbouring hells, you're through whatever reason you want to get into one of the hells. You're kind of like locked outside, and you're trying to get in the house almost, so to speak. So the pit of hot coals, you're climbing through this pit of hot coals, basically, it burns your body. The swamp of decomposing quicksand, basically, you're trying to walk across what looks like a swamp, and it's like an acidic quicksand that as you sink into it, it dissolves you and things. And the hell of weapons, it's essentially you're like running along a footpath, and you feel like you're being chased by dogs and bulls. They're howling behind you. So these different ones, these can be subdivided into many different types as well, you see. So in one, the footpath has razor blades in it to cut your feet. Or in one, you try and have these vines drop down and cut you. Or you try and climb trees to escape the dogs. And the trees are sharp and cut you. And then the acid river is a kind of, you're trying to swim across this river to get to somewhere safe. But you don't realize it's acid until you jump in. Then there's these guardians pull you out and beat you. Shatter your bones and grind you up, and then you start again. So you see the hells are just full of extreme suffering, extreme physical suffering. Then there's sort of a teaching. It comes from mainly expanded on by Nagarjuna, the occasional hells. And this is the temporary hellish situations we experience in any of the six realms of samsaric existence. So this approach can be applied to all six realms. So you can say, while you're a human being, you can have a form of the desire realm, a body of the human, in the form in the desire realm. But through attaining different states of samadhi and meditation, you can have the mind of the form and the formless realms. So these sort of God realms. But in the same way, you can have a mind of a hungry ghost or a mind of an animal. Sort of if you've got extreme ignorance or extreme greed in your mind. So while we talk in a tradition, in the sense that they are also physical realms we're reborn in, they're also a kind of psychological state. Then we'll move on to the hungry ghosts. So the hungry ghosts, they have a general suffering. They're all hungry ghosts. Well, the hungry ghost realm is a bit complicated. So we say that the majority, not all spirits and ghosts are hungry ghosts. So hungry ghosts are a specific category of ghost or spirit. So they don't have necessarily a physical form you can see. So the general suffering they experience is the suffering from thirst, hunger, fatigue, fear, and even heat and cold. And then they have specific sufferings depending on which type of hungry ghost they are. So they can have an external hindrance to obtaining food and drink. So for these kind of hungry ghosts, they cannot see food and drink. Or so maybe if they look at it, they just don't see anything. Or if they see it, they experience food as feces and water as pus. And then there's the ones with the internal hindrances for obtaining food and drink. So there's kind of two approaches here. It could be that they can't open their mouth wide enough to fit any food or drink down. Or as they try and eat any food or drink, their throat closes up and they can't get anything down. And then you also have these kind of hindrances with respect to making use of the food and drink. Because also some of them, they see it as food, they can put it in their mouth, but as it goes into their mouth, it turns into feces and liquids turn into pus. So they have no obstacles to getting it, seeing it and putting it in their mouth, but the obstacles, it changes as they try and eat it. Um, but then there's also kind of other types of suffering they experience. So it's said that some hungry ghosts, the mere act of them looking at a river causes it to dry up. Or if they look at a field of ripe, crops ready to harvest, they all wither and die. It causes the crops to fail. So then there are certain rituals that have been done in the past to kind of beat these hungry ghosts, to get rid of them. But rather than sort of looking after them in a compassionate way, they're whipped and they're beaten and forced out of their home. So then they have this kind of suffering as well. And then if we move on to the suffering of animals, that kind of relates here. So the animals have five main sufferings. The first is the suffering of being killed and being eaten. Death is always a time of suffering for everyone. But for animals, I suppose it's especially traumatic if they're hunted and killed. It's different dying of old age, and suppose, and being able to kind of come to terms with your death compared to a sudden death. Especially, when you see nature documentaries when an animal gets killed, they're full of fear. Then the suffering of being extremely ignorant. Animals are quite stupid, sheep especially. They're a good example of a stupid animal that will climb somewhere to eat some grass on the top of a cliff, but with no way to get down. Because they can climb up a lot better than climb down. So they climb up this cliff, get to the grass, can't get down, and they either stay up there and die, or sometimes they just jump and die. So the animals often aren't able to think about circumstances of what's going on. And then there's a suffering of heat and cold. I think all beings, just about all of us, suffer in this way. It's sort of, then the suffering of hunger and thirst. It's maybe not as extreme as the hungry ghosts, but being hungry and thirsty is very painful and difficult. And then the final one is the suffering of being exploited, beaten, and used for work. So, we treat animals better nowadays, but in the West. But if you go to sort of Asia or even sort of Central and Southern America, you see animals get beaten and they get used to carry more than they can carry and they get beaten to death nearly and things. There's a lot of suffering in there for animals being a work. So they're the lower realms covered, and you kind of need to contemplate their suffering for the small scope as well, because if you want to have happiness of higher rebirth, you need to understand why we don't want to be reborn in the lower realms. And then sort of progressing onto the higher realms is part of the middling scope. So now you want to consider the suffering of the higher realms and why you need to have liberation. So starting with humans, there's kind of 8 suffering that humans undergo. And the first 4 are the suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death. You think when beings are born, they come out crying and in lots of fear, and they've been kind of kept in a warm, dark place, and then suddenly there's a lot of maybe cold, it's bright, there's a towel being wrapped around them, and it's rough, and they're not used to it. And then obviously you want go undergo aging, you get like mental suffering kind of coming from seeing kind of grey hairs forming and things, or the loss of your hair, these kind of things people are attached to cause suffering. But even then, just your body gets old and undergoes suffering, your knees don't work as well, those kind of issues you see in older people. Suffering of sickness is quite clear. You think when you're sick, you desperately want to be free of it. And that causes us to suffer. And just the kind of heat, the cold aspect, and the pain you might undergo. And then the suffering of death, being parted from those you love and your belongings causes suffering, and the manner of death might cause suffering, you don't know. Then the fifth is the suffering of separation and being parted from what you like. You suffer when you have something you enjoy, and then when you don't, you lose it, you suffer. And then you have the suffering of encountering what you dislike. And then when you maybe meet circumstances you don't like, you're not happy and you suffer. And then there's the suffering of not obtaining objects of desire. So in the same way as from things you want, you suffer when you don't have them. So you suffer when you lose them. When you're not able to obtain them, you suffer. And then the suffering of, so that's kind of suffering from meeting what you don't like and not having what you like. And then the 8th is the suffering of contaminated aggregates. This is the all-pervasive compounded suffering of samsara. Because we have contaminated aggregates, we will be reborn in samsara and will undergo suffering again and again until we're free of samsaric existence. And it's just the nature of the aggregates to be in the nature of suffering. Because you have a samsaric body, you don't have a Nirmanakaya body, you don't have the pure body of a Buddha. It undergoes aging, sickness, death. And the same with your mind, you undergo mental suffering because you have this contaminated mind. If you have the pure mind of a Buddha, you don't suffer in the same way. And then the sort of higher realms, these are kind of the harder ones to think about because they experience so much happiness compared to humans. And you can think, okay, but why don't I want to be reborn in these realms? They experience great bliss all the time. They don't undergo suffering like the lower realms or even humans. But then you think of the demigods, the asuras. Well, the asuras literally means not gods. But yeah, in English, it's referring to these beings of the the form realm that aren't quite gods, but they're not humans. So they suffer from jealousy a lot. They want to be a god, they want to have the power of the gods, and this kind of thing. And then that leads them to suffering, and they go to combat because uh, Karmalunda Rinpoche was explaining this summer. Yeah, I think it was Rinpoche. That there is a tree of a wish fulfilling tree grows, and its roots and the base of its trunk are in the demigod realm, but the actual tree flowers in the god realm. So the gods experience the fruit of this wish fulfilling tree. They get everything they desire from it. But the demigod gods don't get this. But they kind of are aware of the tree and they know it exists and they know it provides all this and they want this. So they then go to war with the gods to try and win this wish fulfilling tree. But they're weaker than the gods, so they get killed, and there's suffering there in being stabbed and so on. And when they die, they typically fall into the lower realms because they use up a lot of good karma being reborn in these higher realms. And then the same with the gods. So, in general, gods don't experience any suffering. They experience bliss all the way through their lives, right up until the very end. They are spontaneously born, so they don't have the suffering of birth. And they don't have to worry about not having things they want because they've got this wish fulfilling trait. So, it's said in the period right before a god dies, they they die not. It can be in this war with the demigods, but generally a god dies because their good karma runs out. Their karma to be reborn as a god is expanded, and that's it. So when they begin this process of dying, their body loses color. They normally gods have this very pleasant, fragrant aroma of perfume, and they lose this. And you kind of think they kind of lose this smell, their body loses the colour, no one wants to be around them. All their friends and things don't want to be with them because they smell bad and no one wants to be around that. And yeah, even the jewellery doesn't look nice anymore. So they suffer a lot from being alone at this point. But they're also aware they're dying because gods have omniscience, they can see what's going on. They can see them in the process of dying. And then they look, okay, I'm dying, what's next? Where will I be reborn? Will I be a god again? But they see their karma to be reborn as a god, it's sort of run out. So then they see what realm they're going to be reborn in. And then that causes them to suffer even more because they are aware of what suffering they're about to experience. So Geshe Namdak explained that this is the point to really focus on. If you're struggling to think of the suffering of the god realms, it's this knowing too much almost. If they were ignorant and they didn't know they were going to be reborn, they were going to suffer as an animal or as a hell being, they wouldn't suffer quite as much. But because they have this omniscience, and most gods, when they die, fall into the lower realms, especially as hungry ghosts or hell beings, because they've kind of burnt through all their good karma. So they're seeing how much suffering they're about to experience, and they're going from this total pleasure to total suffering, and it fills them with fear and dread. So that's the main point here of the gods. They suffer a lot because of what's coming. So then it's said this is why it's important that we have this correct understanding of samsaric existence and suffering. We need to be aware of the suffering so it motivates us properly. Because if you do sort of calm abiding meditation, shamatha meditation, and you get attached to the bliss of meditation, so it feels nice and you experience like much pleasure. But if you get attached to the bliss, that's then a cause to be reborn as a god of depending on what samadhi you reach, of whether you have a mind for the form of the formless realms, kind of depends which level of god you'll be reborn as. But essentially, because of this bliss and attachment to this bliss, you'll be reborn as a god, and you waste all the good karma you accumulate by meditating and doing Dharma practice. So to counteract this, you need to think of the faults of samsara and it not be attached to these bliss coming from meditative states. So we've kind of covered there the six realms and their specific sufferings, as well as the general sufferings of samsara. You know, the kind of the general sufferings are clear. The suffering of suffering, we think, you know, pain and so on, these kind of sufferings that we experience all the time, these specific sufferings are included in this. That's very clear to understand. Second, the suffering of change. Again, that's quite clear. It's touched on in some of the specific sufferings. It's the suffering of losing things you're attached to, not meeting things you're attached to, meeting things you dislike, and so on. And then finally, the third is this all pervasive compound suffering. This is the fourth noble truth. Sorry, this is the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. And this is clear. This is, you know, the suffering of samsara that comes from rebirth. Because you're suffering now in samsara, you're going to be reborn in samsara, you're going to suffer again and again. That is the sort of truth of suffering. So that covers the fifth topic of the foundation of all good qualities, the suffering of samsara. And then just to sort of finish off today, we'll cover the next verse as well. Because the next verse is the foundation of all good qualities is led by this pure thought, mindfulness, alertness, and great caution arise. The root of the teachings of keeping the Pratimoksha vows. Please bless for me to accomplish the essential practice. So basically here what we're talking about is to attain. Yeah, I'll just cover this bit, Tenzin, then we'll have a question. Because it's a really short, brief verse. So Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, it comes up throughout the prayer. You have to have morality. You know, if you want to attain liberation, you need to have this union of calm abiding and special insight. To do that, you need calm abiding. And for this, you need, you know, mindfulness, alertness, and great caution, as it's described here. And without pure ethics, without ethical discipline and maintaining your vows, you cannot attain calm abiding. So that's this bit here. And sort of with that as well, we conclude today the middling scope of the land rim. So then next week we'll move on to the great scope of the land rim, starting with bodhicitta. So yeah, what's your question, Tenzin? Okay, yeah. So the other realms. So it all depends on your karma, and you can kind of read in different sutras. The Buddha touches on what causes people to be reborn in different realms. Um, so you see in the hell realms, it's rebirth there is because you have a lot of anger and hatred. These kind of strong afflictions, the time, especially the time of death, but throughout your life, uh, killing, these kind of things, are main causes of rebirth in the hell realms. And then the hungry ghosts, the sort of Preto realm. There's a really good book on this. It's called Hungry Ghosts, and it's just a collection of stories taken from the sutras. Describe it's just different hungry ghosts that appear during the Buddha's life, and explains to people why they were born this way. But in essence, all hungry ghosts are born because of extreme greed and miserliness. So you know, there's stories where people where someone is reborn as a hungry ghost because they refuse to give alms to the previous Buddha because of miserliness. They think, well, he's wasted. You know, what a waste. He should be working and farming like me rather than taking alms off people. Or another one is kind of they own a factory and they don't pay their workers properly and things out of miserliness and greed. They think if they underpay their workers every day, they'll earn, if they're paid by the amount of grain they harvest, but they cheat the scales so they make money and it's done out of greed. And then the animals, they sort of say this is due to acting out of ignorance, because that's the main affliction of the animal realm is ignorance. It's not just like the ignorance of samsara, but it's general ignorance about lots of different topics. Rebirth in animals kind of least clear to me because ignorance is the cause of rebirth in all the realms. So I'm not 100% sure on what. No, the fundamental ignorance is the cause of rebirth in all realms. So I think it's more like the mundane ignorance, especially around karma and so on. But it's quite unclear to me still. And then rebirth as a human is the hardest to achieve because you have to have morality. You need to have good morals. You also need to have enough merit, and you need to have aspirational prayers to be reborn as a human. Because if you have morality and a merit, that's also the cause of being reborn as a demigod or a god. Basically, the it depends on the level of bliss you're attached to. It controls which of the form and formless realms, the kind of gods and demigod realms you're born into. Um, yeah, so the main affliction for humans is desire. Uh, that's sort of the main affliction we experience is excessive desire. So I actually thinking about it, I think sexual misconduct is one of the reasons we reborn as an animal. And that stops you being reborn as a human. That's one of the main ones. But yet once you reach the higher realms, it's less of an affliction causes the rebirth, and it's more the amount of merit and aspiration causes rebirth. So to be reborn in the lower realms, it's because you've got an excess of negative karma from certain afflictions, whereas the higher realms, it's because of merit and sort of aspirations. So it's His Holiness says it's important that yeah. So the Asuras kind of fall into the form realms. So it basically because you have to then you start mixing systems of dividing the world into desire, form, and formless, or the six categories of sentient beings. And so the Asuras and some of the gods belong to the form realms, and the rest of the gods belong to the formless realms. And it's increasing subtle bodies and minds. Yeah, those are the three worlds. So, but basically, the cause to be reborn as a god and a demigod's the same. It's just the difference is the amount of merit and the sort of meditative bliss of attachment you have. Yeah, so if that answers your question, yeah, so most sentient beings in the desire realm, that's, yeah, because the hell beings, the predators, the animals, and the humans are all desire realm beings. Then the asuras belong to the form realm, and the suras, the devas, belong to the form and formless realms. So if that's all your questions, we'll stop there with dedicate. So we'll do the normal dedication versus we do. So when we dedicate, it's important to have three three rounds here, thinking of emptiness, the three spheres of emptiness, the person making the dedication, the act of dedicating, and the aim we're dedicating towards are empty of inherent existence, so they're in the nature of cause and effect and will come true. So, yeah, as we've seen, sort of discussing there, which realm we're born in, it's important to, His Holiness emphasizes this, that we need to have the aspiration to be reborn as a human. That's quite important. So, thinking you'll return to benefit sentient beings. So, with that in mind, we'll recite the prayers. Dagi jine sapegawadi tendandowa kunla gampeda kepa jetso losanda pai tempe ningpo ringdu selze sho gangwe bawe kowe kamso pendandowa malu shumwene chenwe zibang tenzi gyatso yi shape site balu tenyu chi. And then dedicate for the generation and increase of renunciation, bodhicitta, and the view of emptiness. Nature sampa rinpo che make panham kyu chi yepan yampa mepa ya gong ye gong du pelwa sho. Jangcho semcho rinpo che make panham kyu chi yepan yampa mepa ya gong ye gong du pelwa sho. Tongni tawa rinpoche make panam kekuchi kepa nyampa mepaya gongye gongdu belwa sho. As long as space remains, as long as migrators remain, until may too remain, to dispel the suffering of migrators. So thank you very much.